So what I want to do is share screen, and I want to put up a poem by Vincent Katz called On the Subway. And I want to read it. It's in honor of anybody who in cities where there are subways and other kinds of closed-in mass transit in the cold weather when the windows are starting to be closed. Or subways such as New York where most of the windows don't work. And it's a very difficult space to re-enter, but it's so vital to the workings of cities like New York and Paris and London and so many others. And in honor of those people who are trying it out, including some members of my family when they have to, on the subway. So I'm going to share screen of that. Let's see what happens when I do. Okay, I'm going to read the poem, and meantime, it's in ModPo Plus, so maybe someone in the Zoom will share the link, and maybe people on the social media platforms will share a link there if they can, for those who are participating. I'll read the poem, and then what I want to do is ask each of you super briefly, like one comment each, to just say something in response to anything that's going on here, okay? On the subway. If I think of something that happened, what was that something that happened between two people on the subway this morning on the way to work or wherever it is one goes early in the morning? As the day wears on, it seems it could be something one could talk about or not, certainly not do anything about. Not now that the moment has passed, that will only be something that lingers in the mind for a little while, then grows cloudy and wraith-like. It seems so distinct, something one could always remember. Okay, so I want to start with Allie. Really, I know we've never talked about this poem, and or Anna and I did for a ModPo Minute, but so just anything you're thinking about this. Allie, you first. You're a New Yorker. How the subway is doing?
This poem gives me the feels because I've taken the subway a little, but not daily like I'm used to, and I really miss it. It's like one of the things I miss the most. And I think what's kind of amazing and thought-provoking about this poem is we don't really get a lot of indication about not necessarily the value of whatever this thing that happened was, this event, but we don't know the nature of it. This thing that happens between two people, it could be like a moment of like desire or kindness or violence. Like it could be so many things. It could basically be anything. And yet the poem leaves enough space to accommodate something, you know, anything from a kind of like traumatic moment to a moment of, you know, elation.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. Anna's next, then Max. Everybody be real brief.
I really like the way that this just makes a poem out of the process of just trying to remember something or trying to think of something. It like makes actually a sonnet, because I just counted the lines and remember that it's a sonnet, makes a sonnet out of really like that like labored sort of like process of trying to just apprehend something. And I just think that's really beautiful.
Nice. Max, and then Mandana will be on deck.
I know this is a little bit more contemporary than our hardcore New York school poets, right? But I think that there's a wonderful nostalgia here, I think, for what public transit would have been like 50, 60 years ago, that there's this world of just casual interaction and a world, I'm going to sound like slightly techno-reactionary or something here, but it's a world without smartphones. It's a world where people are not being distracted by devices, that there's actually this possibility for encounters here on the subway that just isn't really the case anymore. I'm sure that big fans of New York, and the subway could, tell me I'm wrong. I'm sure that's true. But I think that, every time I'm on the L in Chicago, or if, I've taken the subway in New York, it's packed, it's crowded, and everybody's on their devices, everybody's distracted. There's this really demeaning like commuter thing going on, where there just doesn't seem to be this possibility anymore for these kinds of interactions, or to have your eye caught by a stranger or something like that.
And do you think memory, Max, is affected negatively by that? Because this is a poem about trying to remember something that's ordinary.
Well, I don't want to double down entirely on my like anti-smartphone device thing here that I'm going on. So I'm not going to go so far as to say that memory or something, that we're losing our capacity to remember something. I don't want to go all that far, but I do think I just want to locate more this kind of nostalgia, I think, that's happening in this poem for a world where these sorts of details were more captivating, or there was a possibility for these kinds of details to captivate us differently.
Great, thank you. Mandana's next, and then Gabe.
I've written the subway a little bit since the pandemic, but not a lot. So as what probably doesn't surprise anyone who knows me is, for all the subway writing I've done, I meet people, I talk to people, I have conversations, which is kind of an anti-New York thing to be doing.
That you do that.
It's a shock. I realize that. So there's always the possibility in those days for me of incredibly meaningful temporary intimacies, where people tell you about they know they're never going to see you again, but within that moment, it's kind of that foxhole feeling of things that you share with people, and they share with you. And that's gone right now. The times that I've written it now, we're all masked. There's so much you can tell from, no one's even looking at each other in the eyes. And I have such a sadness for that. I don't know if the other will ever really return. So reading this piece, which is really rather beautiful, my sadness is not for a long time ago gone by, but 9 months ago gone by.
Yeah.
And I'm hard pressed to see it any other way other than my voice is catching, with a tremendous sadness of also thinking about a lot of people lost who probably rode those subways. So for me right now, this poem, there are a lot of ghosts in this poem.
Yeah, that is the fate of rereading a poem like this right now. Gabe, and then Davey.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be more technical than heartfelt, but I want to say that what I think I like about the end of this poem is the movement between the moment that becomes a sort of lingering memory, which becomes cloud-like or wraith-like. It's sort of like the movement between the individual and the crowd. And I think if I had to sort of draw my like analogy, it's sort of like the relationship between an individual memory and one's memory is like the relationship between the individual and the crowd that the individual is in. So that's all.
I love that. Thank you. Davey, and then Jess.
So the natural interlocutor of the New York School for me is a canonical work of sort of public city planning history, which is Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is a wonderful 1961 book against urban planning in New York, which has lots of problems, but is still super lovely to read. There's a million excerpts of it online if you're interested in it. And something that Jacob says about cities that makes them different is the kinds of tiny iterable contacts you have with people, where your urban space puts you in situations with people where you're like, have this like fleeting, immediate, disappearing kinship relationship with them, where they're not like a person you've never met, and they're not like your friend or family member, but they're in this like weird intermediary space. And for me, that's what this poem is about, is the like kind of like temporary, important, this is such a cute cat, Gabe, oh my goodness. Kinship relation that you have with someone, and that those kinship relations that, like, you know, if you see someone, if you're in urban space and see someone like have an accident or like get like a pedestrian gets hit by a bicycle, like you immediately run to help them. And that's like all like right under the surface of the city is people like being able, this is just the cutest cat ever. It's so cute. People being able to like jump in and help one another. And that's not quite happening, but it's like almost always about to happen. And that specific kind of kinship relation, it's like Skylar looking at his neighbor in his window. People who are not people who are strangers, but also not people who you know, who could become important but also are important for their like unknown singularity to you. I think that like that's a really New York School feeling, and this poem is so good at expressing it.
Thank you, Davey. Jess, then Lily, then Jason, briefly, please.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add to what Davey said, because I think I've been thinking along the same lines, but one of the things I love about this poem, which is new to me, is that this idea of something is sort of wonderful in its opacity. And to me, that's just so much of what is missing from life right now, is being able to exit your own little sphere of activity and mundanity and go out and just see stuff that you can't really interpret, but that somehow, for whatever reason, seems really important, and like you might be able to remember it.
Yeah, and what you just said is such a great way of defining what the New York School is doing generally about the everyday. Lily, then Jason.
Something that I've been thinking about here is, I know we've talked about this in terms of memory, but I almost see this as Katz reframing riding the subway as like a collective dream, like a dreamscape that's shared by everyone who's also navigating the city. And that really stood out to me, especially if you pre-pandemic commute to work in the morning or at a time when you're a little bit groggy and something really weird happens on transit, and then you get to work and you're like, why do I feel like I had a really weird dream or something before I got here? So that's just knowing the New York School tendency to also include dreams and dreamscapes. I liked this like translation of that dream landscape into a real life piece of urban transit network.
Thank you. And Jason, final thought on this one before we turn to final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, something that strikes me about this poem is the kind of almost mournful tone of how that this intimacy, like this intimate contact with another person, eventually kind of thins out and evaporates and becomes part of a blur of, you know, in the city, millions of such contacts. But I think that this poem is now dated because of the number of, because our geo position is marked by our iPhones, and like you could go on the subway and like somebody who's queer could go on Grindr and find out there's another queer person looking to meet up 2 cars away, and they could end up meeting and getting married. So the strangeness of our proximity has jumped into a techno stranger space in which the question of the stranger and the nearby and the proximate is flipped around and not the same as it is in this poem anymore.
Yeah. I also think about the subway as a place where people took refuge from connectedness, which is a version of what you were saying and what Max is saying, and that this poem is kind of celebrating that. I have a final thought about this poem, and then I want to start with Anna for a final word for the webcast. I think this poem is it occurred to me as you guys were talking, this poem is a rejoinder to and a rewriting of Robert Frost's For Once Then Something. That's a poem about a person who has to, in the pardon me, fake Frost sense, has to go to some rural location, looks down a well and is trying to get past modern narcissism, and then waits for the moment when the water in the well clears so that the speaker can see down to the bottom there's a pebble of quartz, which might be the truth. And so there's this moment of clarity, and in it we have the problem of seeing truth through the clear water gets interrupted by clouds and wraiths of clouds. It's almost word for word what happens in this poem. And I think I prefer this because, first of all, it locates that search in the city underground instead of in this kind of bucolic, classic Frostian lyrical spot. This poem also reminds me of In a Restless World Like This Is, which we're going to talk about next week, very much so, that blur that Jason was talking about. And it also makes me very happy because the poem is kind of about the loose ties as opposed to the strong ties between people of family and loved ones, but loose ties are kind of what the world is made of. We've talked about that in relation to the ModPo community.